Going deeper, interacting with the database via handlers. So if you've been to a couple of my earlier presentations, we looked at interaction attendant, IVR stuff, we looked at just overall customization. This session is specifically going to look at the handlers tools and how to interact with the database using handlers various ways. So George Ganal, been here 20 years between interactive intelligence and Genesis now. Started with, how many people started with version 1.2 of Interaction Center? Anybody? Back at 1.2? 1.3? Oh dear. I'm going to date myself. Anyway, I started with Interaction Center in 1999. Started learning handlers back then. Just played with them for a lot of years. So hopefully I'll be able to communicate to you something useful today. We're going to go through the database tools, how you connect via ODBC to a database and get stuff back and forth with it, as opposed to the standard connection, which is for a reporting database, which is done through Interaction Center, connects up in a different way, and you can only use Oracle or SQL for that type of database connection. This, you can use any ODBC compliant database, basically. We'll talk about the database tools themselves, OC database tool, ODBC database tools, and then we'll talk about the Interaction Center specific ones, which are still able to talk to most any database, but you have to do some configuration in Interaction Administrator to be able to use them. And you actually use a connection through Interaction Administrator to talk to the database. Using them in handlers, so we'll look at a couple sample handlers, go through writing to a database, reading from a database, and then we'll talk about various options at the end. So, ODBC database tools, these are the main ones you use, and the sequence is important when you're using ODBC to connect to a database. One of the things you need to do first, hopefully I can get to this. Desktop here. Control panel, administrative tools on the Windows Server. You notice on the Windows Server you have ODBC data sources, 32-bit and 64-bit. It's extremely important that you set up your ODBC data source as 32-bit because that's what Interaction Center uses. If you set it up as an ODBC data source for 64-bit, you will not be able to use it with Interaction Center for handlers. Just note that. So when you're setting it up, 32-bit. And in here, the way you'll be able to tell if you're in the right one, by the way, is you're going to go to the System DSN tab, and you'll see the Contact Reporting and Tracker database DSNs there. If you don't see those, you're in the wrong place. So set them up on your IC server. If you're going to be working on a separate machine, so you're doing handler development on your own desktop, you need to set up the same data source on your desktop as you're using on the IC server. Exact same name, login, all that kind of stuff. So that you can use it while you're doing development, but then the IC server can use the exact same data source when it's running against the database itself. So I created my own data source here. Points to my server, which is MS1. Real tight security on mine. You have to use SQL Server authentication, not NT authentication. So you have to have an account on the database server that's used for communicating with it from Interaction Center. You want to change the default database to the one that you're going to be using for that particular DSN. And you also want to make sure you test it to verify that everything's working before you go start trying to do your development in Interaction Center. That's some important stuff. Not really in the presentation, but I want to point that out. All right. So I'm just going to jump over to a handler and talk about some of these things in order. But the main order, well, I'll talk about it here first. There's a DB open tool step that's used to open the database initially. We're not actually talking to it yet, but that's what uses that data source to actually start communicating with the database. And you'll open the database, then you will connect to the database. You can have one or more connections, but it's recommended that within a single handler you limit it to one connection at a time to the database. You could do multiple, but behavior can get a little bit odd sometimes if you're doing multiple simultaneous connections to the same database in the same handler. Multiple handlers, not a problem. Same handler could cause some problems. So you open a connection to the database, and that is stored in the DB connection variable, which actually is a variable that's a special data type. It's extended data type. If you look at it in the debugger, you won't see any information in it. You can't read it. It's just a holding place for the connection information to the database. So you open a connection, and then you can perform your other functionality going against the database. You can query the database. You can write to the database. You can use some of our tools to just basically update records, delete records, do whatever you want. You can send a full SQL statement over to the database through one of the tools. And there's some quirks to it that I'll talk about. Then once you're done talking to the database, you need to release the connection. You may want to open another connection for another function to a different table in the database, something like that. So you can open and close connections, and then when you're all done for the handler, you need to make sure you've released all connections and close the database. Technically, when the handler ends, it will close the connections and it will close the database. Technically, normally, usually it works fine. But just best practice, close the connection, close the database before the end of the handler, just to make sure that nothing goes wrong. Nothing gets cached, nothing gets hung up, whatever. So that's best practice. And then we'll talk about the DB stored procedure tools a little bit as well. Maybe you've never used the DB stored procedure, maybe you don't know anything about it. The help on it is a little bit cryptic. I'll say right up front on this disclaimer here. DB stored procedure tool stuff never actually got fully completed when they were developing it. So it's got some quirky behavior. You have to know what you're doing to be able to use it. But once you know what you're doing, it is very powerful. So here, I've got an example, just doing a simple query to a database, and I'm going to look up a customer order. So I want to, let's see if I can open up the database real briefly. And have it there, yeah, there we go. So here's my database server. You can see I've got this adventure sales database, and here's the orders table within it. So I've got my order ID, my customer ID, product ID, extended price, number of people, amount due, correlation ID. Basically, the information gets entered into this table. People place an order in our system, and I'm not going to show you all that stuff. That's an interaction attendant. They go through an IVR. They press menu options to put in a catalog number and then how many people they want to send on the trip and that kind of thing. And then it builds an order entry. The database is set up with seeded values in the order ID, so it will automatically generate the next order ID in sequence. So I don't have to know what the order ID is going to be. I just write to the database, it creates an order ID. Problem being, if I'm in a handler and I want to immediately query that order to find out what the order ID is, I need to have something that I can query on, hence the column at the end, the correlation ID. If you were here in the last session, we talked about the unique ID tool step. All I did was take the unique ID, generated it, dumped it into the database along with the order information, and then I ran a query to pull back the order number and the price and all that kind of stuff based upon that correlation ID. Just made it easy so I knew. Otherwise, I'd have to query and say, bring me all the orders that were entered today and put them in descending order based upon the time they were entered, and I'll just pick the top one, presuming that was the last order that they entered and it's the one we're currently working with. Yeah, that's a race condition. Maybe somebody else entered another order with their ID right after. So, that's the structure of the database, and you can look at it. In my tables, you do need to know things such as what are the data types on those columns. So, standard database. I need to know that the order ID is an integer, the customer ID is an integer, the product ID is an integer, extended price is a money data type. Well, money data type, do we have that in Interaction Designer? No. What do we have? We've got numeric. So when we pull it in, we'll have to match it up with the numeric instead of money data type, because we don't have a money data type. Number of people is an integer. Amount due, it's a money data type again. Correlation ID is just an nvarchar. So that nvarchar, what does that match up to in Interaction Center, in the Designer? String, because we don't have nvarchar. Fairly simple there, but you do need to know what's in the database so that when you are setting up variables to hold the information, they're with the right data type. Otherwise, your query can't be set up. Geo desktop. There we go. So, my subroutine here is presuming that we've already entered the order, and now I'm going to query, and I'm going to pull back all the information for all of the, for a specific customer ID, all the orders for that customer, and I'm going to play them back to that customer through the IVR. One of the things you'll notice here, I showed this a couple of sessions ago, if you were in my IVR attendant one, there's a get structured parameter. This is just an example of something you can do in Interaction Administrator. I have them under the server container, structured parameters, and the database login. I have them as secret values in the Interaction Administrator side. So technically, I don't have to give the database administrator or the database login information to the handler developer. They can just pull the structured parameters, somebody typed it in here, it's secret, they can't see it there. As was pointed out in the other session though, when you put the handler in debug mode, you'll see those in plain text in the debug. So, it's kind of secret, but kind of not for a handler developer. But at least I can set it up so that other people looking at administrator or wherever don't get to see those values. There's more done as an example. There's also something I'm going to be using later. And this is a where clause. And we're going to be using this in my query. Part of the query is I need to set it up so that, okay, I'm just building a select statement for a database. So select order ID from the orders table where customer ID equals the customer ID that they entered in the IVR. Fairly simple, but the where clause has to be a string, and I have to format it in such a way that the where part of it, where customer ID equals the string they entered in the IVR, well, I can't just say where customer ID equals whatever, because that's not a valid string in our system. Plus, customer ID, as it's passed through the handler, is a string. What data type is it in the database? It's an integer. So if I just put customer ID in, that would probably work because integer should be something without quotes. But if I didn't really understand what I was doing, and I put SQL string, which is an operator we have, that takes a variable and puts it into the right format for the data type to pass it through SQL to a database, that would put it in the wrong format because if I wrap SQL string around S customer ID, it'll put quotes around it, and that'll break my query. So you need to be careful how you use these tools. You have to know what it should look like and then make the string format look like that. So here my where clause equals, I've got the quotes, customer ID. I mean, how many people have been doing SQL queries for a while? Does it matter if you put spaces around the equal sign? Usually you say, it depends on the database. Yeah. So force of habit from the old days when too many of my queries broke because I did not have spaces around the equal sign. I always put spaces around my equal sign in this string here. Just because Goop to SQL base broke, or some others along the way. Ampersand, you need to make sure you have that space after the equal sign for sure. Well, no, you don't. Never mind. Depends on the database. Ampersand is a concatenation SQL string. That's the operation that takes whatever is inside the parentheses and turns it into the right format for the data type for a SQL statement going to the database. So the SQL string wraps around 2i, to integer. That's customer IDs. We're converting the string to an integer, and then we're converting that into the right format for a SQL string. Did I need to do that? No, because I know what I'm doing. I could have just put as customer ID and it would have been fine, since that puts it in the correct format for the query. What I'm teaching how I show, okay, here's how you can do this with SQL string. And the ampersand, make sure there's another space, and then I can put in order by, order ID ascending. So I can actually do an order by, or I don't think I can do group by in there. It won't let me do that. It'll let me do an order by in that query. A lot of the functionality, you cannot, with a query, you cannot do nested queries. You cannot do, cannot query from two different tables. You cannot do a join, an outer join, or an inner join. None of that's available in a query. So that's too complicated for the DB query tool set. Single query to a single database table, single database, and about as complicated as you can get is an order by. And you have to assign that to a variable because later on in the DB query it won't accept just an expression. I can't just type it in there. So I do my DB open. Fairly simple. I'm using that data source I showed you. Username, I'm pulling those two in from the structured parameter, or I could just type them in here in quotes because they're strings. Then database variable name, dbvar, and then whatever you want to call it. That's an extended data type variable, and I name it dbvar to show, using the Hungarian notation that it's a DB variable. And then I name it for the company that I was working for, Innovative Investments. And I could put maximum database connections. I could say 1, which is the best practice, or I could have multiple if I wanted to, but it's really recommended you just put 1. So that opens the database. Then you have to, little key to life here. On the failure path, I put a log event tool step that will actually log this out to my Microsoft application event log. So if there's an error on one of these steps along the way, I don't have to open the IP log or the IPDB server log and find the information there. I can just look in my Microsoft application event log and see, there's an error and here's where it occurred in which handler. And then I can go digging into the logs if I want to. Get connection, I use that database variable, and then I create a connection variable, and I have a timeout. How long do I want to wait before I give up on the connection? That all depends on your environment. Key to life here, if this is in an IVR and somebody's on the phone and they're trying to pull up their order information, guess what? They're waiting 30 seconds of dead air right here. If you have a 30-second timeout, it actually takes the whole timeout. So you probably, right before you do this, you might want to have a send customer notification tool step that goes off and runs a side handler which plays hold music or something to the call while it's doing the database lookup. So at least they think they're still connected. Just a little side note. That's not part of this lecture, that's just a side what you could do. Once I get the connection, then I can use my query. We'll go on to, here's my DB query down here. I took it off because I'm going to show the stored procedure as well. This DB query tool step, I have to log into that data source. And then here, my connection settings, I've got the connection variable, I got the data source, got the table that I'm going to use. It's got a drop down, so once I've logged into the data source, I can see all the tables in that database. There's a runtime table name. So let's say I'm working in a development server. I've got one data source name that I'm using on the development server. And then in production, I'm going to have a different table name, even though it's the same structure. It needs to be the same structure, but I got a different table name. And I could actually put in a fully qualified table name there with database name dot owner name like DBO or whatever dot table name. So I can fully specify the runtime table name in there, which would be when I publish this on the IC server from my development system, I don't actually have to get onto the IC server. I don't have to actually connect to the full production database to get this to work. I can just copy the handler over, type in the runtime table name on the production IC server, and it will connect up, should connect up fine, as long as the structure is the same. So I'm not going to use that runtime table name while I'm doing my development with my local development server, but once I put it on the production server, it's going to run against the production SQL server, I can put in a runtime table name. and then a timeout for how long I want to wait to do the query. If I want to put in a timeout, don't have to. You bind the table columns, whichever ones you want to use, to local variables. So I've got my I order ID, I for integer, Hungarian notation from the old Microsoft standards. So I'm binding that order ID table column to my local integer variable. Notice that when I choose this dropdown, it only brings back numeric and integer type variables. It will not let me try to bind it to a string. Not possible. Also note that unlike the assignment tool step and others, there is no new variable option in here. So you have to create the variables before you do the DB query, which I always forget. And I go to choose it from the dropdown, and it's not there. So I have to close out of the tool and go back and create the variable, and then come back to the tool and use it. Because I'm just forgetful. Anybody here ever go to a restaurant and say, you know what, I'm having a senior moment, could I have a senior discount? Doesn't work. Customer ID I'm not going to use because that's what I'm feeding in. I don't care about the return. And actually the only return I really care about for this particular handler will be the amount due and the order ID. Because I'm going to play back, here's your order ID number, and here's how much money you owe on that order. Here's your other order ID number, here's how much money you owe. And just loop through all the orders. And then here at the bottom is the where clause variable. So once again, it has to be a string. We had to create it ahead of time, and we just choose the string data type variable. There's no option here to create an expression and fill it in on the fly. So I have to create the variable ahead of time with the information, and then choose it here. Once again, there's no option to create a new variable at this point. So that's a DB query. One of the quirks of a DB query is that it goes out and it comes back with a result set, but you can't see the result set. It doesn't just populate the variables right away. It's bound to those variables. It says, here's the variables I'm going to populate, but when you do the query, the result set comes back. You have to do another step called the fetch to actually pull results out of the result set. So here's a DB fetch. And there's really nothing to it other than the DB connection and then a timeout for how long it's going to wait to try and fetch the results. What a DB fetch does is it pulls the top result out of the result set, deletes it from the result set, and populates the variables with the values that are in that record from the result set. If you have 5 records, you need to do fetch 5 times, and you need to do something with the results each time to store them aside. Because if you just pull the top record off, well, maybe you only want the top record, the most recent order. Great. You've already sorted descending. We're just going to pull out the top record, play it back, and that's it. But if we want to play all of their orders, I'm going to have to fetch multiple times. So, you notice here, I do a DB fetch, I pull back, what? The top entry in the list, and it gets deleted from the list. And then I play a string, say your order number is, and then I would do a nice prompt if I were doing this for real. Play the integer, feed in that order ID. I elucidate set to true because I want to play single digits. Not your order ID is 1,352. And then play another prompt saying, and you has a total amount due of, and play numeric this time, and choose play as dollars and cents set to true because we want to play dollars and cents. Now you notice it's not actually set to play right away. It's just storing all these up in the buffer. So it's going to fetch, it's going to store this stuff in the buffer, the audio buffer. It's going to loop back around, do the next DB fetch. As long as there are still records in the list, in the record set, it's going to keep taking success path, and it's going to keep caching all that info in the buffer. When there are no more records left, it does a fetch, says, oh, no more records, failed. So it goes over to the DB release connection, which is just based upon the DB connection variable. DB close, just based upon the database variable. And then I've got to flush audio at the very end, which flushes all the audio in the buffer. It says wait for play completion. We don't want anybody to barge in. So it's going to play everything right there, and they'll hear your order number such and such has an amount due of this. Your order number such and such has an amount due of this. And it loops through, or just plays all the audio that was built in the background. So that's one way to do it. I could have done parallel list variables and just dumped the values into list variables instead, but for me it's just simple example. I'm playing it back right away. So that's the sequence for doing a query from a database. But remember, query cannot do an outer join, cannot do an inner join, cannot query from multiple tables, cannot do most of the stuff you want to do with a query, right? So what do? Any thoughts? Yeah, of course, you use the DB stored procedure. Why don't I use, there are other tools we could think about using, and I'll talk about more of them in a minute or two, but for example, there's a DB SQL exec tool step. And here I've got settings, a database connection, okay, so I can take my database connection and I got a SQL statement variable and a timeout. I can write any SQL statement I want. I can do a complicated query, select statement, outer join, inner joins, multiple tables, whatever. I could write that really nice complicated SQL statement, put it in here, send it over to the database with this DB SQL exec tool step. I can do that. What's the main problem? Do you see any outputs on this thing? No. I can send a query, but it's not going to give me anything back because this tool step cannot receive data back from the database. You can only send data to the database. So what could I do? Well, I've known people who, on the fly, use a DB SQL exec, for example, to create a temporary table in the database using that unique ID tool step. So you create a unique table, temporary table, using all that functionality, and then you do a DB query against that temporary table to get the data back that you want, because now it's a single table or a single view. You can create a view as well, populate a view. Once you get the data back that you want, and then you can delete the temporary table because you've got the ID for it. You just send another DB SQL exec to delete the table. That's something you could do. Not the easiest, but something you could do. Or you could use this DB stored procedure. Now, before I can use the DB stored procedure, I have to actually go into my utilities and I have to set up the stored procedure ahead of time. I have to create the configuration for it. So here's where it gets kind of confusing and the help isn't the greatest help it could be because, well, let's just say I've got my own documents from emails from the developer who created it in the old days who helped me wander through how to actually do this. So we have underneath utilities, we have stored procedures. I've got my data source that I've already created. The schema that I'm using in this case is the DBO schema, not the system schema. And then I choose the stored procedure. So I created my own stored procedure in the DBO schema to run a query against the database. And I just did a real simple one. I didn't do any joins or anything like that in this particular stored procedure. But essentially it does the same thing that my other DB query does, except it's a stored procedure on the server side, so I'm not eating anything up on the IC side as far as processor, doing the query, and all that kind of stuff. It's going to run on the server. So I've got the stored procedure, and then I had to add in. It doesn't give me a list of things to choose from. It doesn't give me the list of the tables. I need to know the table names and type them in properly. So I created result columns for order ID. It's position number 1. This is key. Remember, order ID is position number 1 or ordinal 1. And then I created one for amount due as a decimal, ordinal 2. Great. So you do that initial setup. There are more results columns that could come back, and actually probably will come back from that DB query, or excuse me, that stored procedure, but I'm only interested in these 2. Then I go to my DB stored procedure, and because I already set that up in the utilities menu, I use the exact same stuff here, the DSN, the schema, the stored procedure that I'm using. And here's the parameter. What's missing from down below here? Well, what's missing is the return values. right? So if I just run it like this, it'll pull back the top value in the result set. If I don't do anything else, I can actually run the stored procedure, it will populate, or it'll pull back some results, but I would have to, I don't have any way really to bind them to something to actually use them in my handler. So I had to go to the result set tab, and I had to, once again, bind these results. So these two results come back from the ones that are configured up above in that utilities menu. And you notice it's position 1 and position 2. The main thing to know is that you may have 10 columns in that database table, but when you set up the stored procedure on the utilities menu, you say this column is ordinal 1. It doesn't matter what order it is in the table at all. You are designating it as ordinal 1. This one is ordinal 2. And you have to actually pick here, or see them here, as far as what position number we're talking about within that result set. They have to match. So if you go change the stored procedure definition up here under utilities, you have to come back here and change it, make sure it matches up again. The other parameters here, you have a runtime stored procedure, so just like that runtime table name on the query, I can put in a runtime stored procedure, so I can point to a different stored procedure on the main production database when I actually copy this over to my IC server and run it there. Do my own development on my development server, and it should just work if I have the right stored procedure name on the main server. The execution string is a really interesting one because, okay, right here I've got a stored procedure, I've got the input to the stored procedure, I've got the result columns. What you don't see here is that in the execution string, it's not really well documented. I could send any SQL string I want to the database server through execution string. It's just like the DB SQL exec. So if I don't want to write a stored procedure, I don't have to actually use the stored procedure that's designated there. I can override it by putting in my own execution string. So I can create a wholly, fully complicated execution SQL statement, do whatever I want, updates. I can do updates to the database, I can do deletes in the database, I can do queries in the database, I can do outer joins, inner joins, whatever I want to do. I create a SQL string that does all that wonderful stuff, and I put it in this execution string field, and it'll go run on the server. And then the beauty of it is, if I know in my execution string what the results are going to be, and I know what they're named as, then I can go into that utility menu, and in the stored procedure settings, I can create results that'll come back, and I can actually get a result set even though it's not showing up technically in the stored procedure that I have listed. I can pull results back from that complicated execution string. So a way to get around that DB SQL exec or DB SQL exec 2 tool step, where you can send a statement to the database and not get stuff back, you can use the exact same SQL statement here, but if you set it up right in the utility menu, you can get results back and use them in your handler. Does that make sense? It's one of those little known facts about the stored procedure. It was not really an intended side effect. It was something the developer put in there because he was using it for testing and doing some stuff on his own. But people discovered, hey, we could actually use that and send a statement and get results back and pull them into the handler. It's really cool. So that's a word to the wise type thing. So you would, like I said, you would have to go to the utilities menu in the stored procedure, just pick one, doesn't matter what one it is, create a result set, and then here tie the results to the right the variables in your handler with the right ordinal order, and in your execution string, just write something that will match up with those results. But here I'm just using the actual stored procedure, and the results come back from it. So that's another thing I could do here instead of my DB query to pull results back. And then with that, I would use the same fetch sequence, loop around, fetch all the results that came back from that stored procedure. Does that make sense? Sense so far? Any questions so far on this stuff? Throwing a lot at you, I know. Okay. Remember what time I'm supposed to end. Before I get in too much trouble. So, 45 after 20 minutes. Good. So the other two that I mentioned in here, let me just create a new handler real quick. The DB SQL exec uses that same sequence where you have to open the database and connect to it and all that kind of stuff. It's got the database connection here. You put in your SQL statement variable, you have a timeout. That one's just real simple. You send the SQL statement over, you have no idea if it succeeded or failed or what happened. All you know is you send a SQL statement over the database. And it did whatever, and you just have to hope it worked. There's a failure exit path, but that won't tell you why it failed or give any codes or anything like that. The DB SQL exec 2 adds a little bit more functionality because it has a no rows exit path. So if you are sending something over and it had 0 rows affected, it's an update, it's a delete, it's a whatever, create temporary table. If no rows were affected, it takes the no rows exit path. If there's a failure, so you have the input, there's a data source, there's a SQL command, you have a timeout, and you have check count of affected rows. That has to be true to actually take that affected rows exit path, if none were affected. And the output is an affected row count, so how many rows did you update? If you send an update statement, you think it should affect 10 rows and only affected 5, something went wrong. And then there's an error code. The error code is an integer that comes back from the database, and it's just the standard error code that gets thrown by the database server. You don't necessarily know what that means in here, but you'd have to take that code and then probably have an email tool step or something that emails it to you, and then you go look it up in the documentation for the database and figure out why it failed. And go on and do that. So this one's a little bit more powerful, but it also still requires that you go through that full sequence using the DB open and so on. There's also, excuse me, sorry, I'm lying on that one, I think. Yes. This is what I meant to point out. The DB SQL exec runs through that standard DB opener and everything. The DB SQL exec 2, instead of running through that DB open and DB get connection and so on, it uses interaction center, interaction administrator settings to create the connection to the database. So we look in interaction administrator under IC data sources. I had to create an IC data source configuration that points to that same ODBC connection. So it's a Microsoft SQL Server type. I don't want it to be read-only if I'm going to be writing to the database. I have to type in the ODBC data source name, so it's kind of clunky. You have to make sure you type things correctly, because if you don't type correctly, it's not going to work. User ID and password, you have to put those in there for connecting to the database. And then it's extremely important, especially if you're going to be using this with interaction attendant, that you have to put in the qualifier, such as sys or DBO or whatever the qualifier is that's on the tables that you're going to be using, or stored procedures. So if you have stored procedures, some of them are system stored procedures, some are DBO stored procedures, some are whatever username. Just make sure you put the qualifier in there, or else you will not actually be able to connect to that database using interaction administrator settings. If that's blank, your queries are going to fail every time through interaction attendant, for example. So that's the setting. Source name. I'll just copy it, and we would want to paste it in here. Make sure you put it inside quotes. And then you put in your SQL command, and here you can actually type it right in the field if you want. You don't have to create it as a variable first. So you just put it right in here. There's a timeout and so on. And then you can use this tool step to send. Usually you're going to use it for an update or delete. or some kind of insert, something like that, putting information into the database. Okay, normal. And that decreases the amount of complexity because you don't have to worry about closing the database connection and closing the database and all that kind of stuff when you're done. A lot less messy. But you cannot just run a query and get data back. If you use this to create a temporary table and then you want to query it, then you have to open the database and connect and all that other stuff. That's that data source within Interaction Administrator. I've already talked about database store procedure, but I'm going to go back over and we're going to look at an order entry handler instead. So here, instead of just querying the database, we're going to write the order into the database. So this is the initial order entry that we would be doing from the IVR. And I don't have all the IVR stuff up here for display because that's attendant, and of course you already know all that. But what I did in attendant is I had an IVR which prompted them for their customer ID, and it stored that in an attribute on the interaction. And then I prompted for what product do you want to order? And they have a catalog, so they punch in the number of the product they want to order. And it stores it as an attribute on the interaction. And then what is the number of travelers going on this trip? Because they're booking travel to go somewhere. And okay, 3 travelers, great. That goes through the IVR, gets added as an attribute to the interaction. So those pieces of information are brought into this subroutine when I do a custom subroutine call from attendant, and I pull them off of the interaction with get attribute. Now, key to life here, once again, is pulling off the attribute customer ID. What data type do you get when you pull an attribute off an interaction? You get a string. What is it in the database? It's an integer. So you need to keep that in mind when you're writing your queries or any other stuff you're doing for your inserts and so on. Product ID, also an integer in the database. The number of travelers, integer in the database. So there are a number of things here we need to actually know so that when we're communicating with the database, we use the right data types for our communication. So we open the database, we get the connection. Now we have to query and get information out of the database based upon the product ID. I need to get the price for that particular trip because I've got the number of people going, but now in the database I need to pull out the price, which is my information, and come up with the total amount due for that trip. So where product ID equals, and then ampersand S product ID. How come I'm using the SQL string operator here? Oh, because I'm lazier and I don't want to do all that typing. And I happen to know that if I have a string or a SQL statement where product ID equals 10002 without any quotes around it, then that's perfect. That's what the database expects. I don't need to use that SQL string function. So this puts it in the right format because I happen to know how to write one properly. Do my DB query, and it's going to pull back the price. Dump it into a variable named end price. In the database, the extended price is a money data type. In the handler, it's a numeric data type. Equivalent, not exactly the same. And then the where clause is pulled in down here. Fetch the value. And I'm only fetching it once because I only want the price one time. I don't need to fetch, there's only one record of that product ID, so I'm only fetching it once. Then I have to assign something I'm going to write to the database. I'm going to create an amount due, numeric value, because it's going to write into the database to a money data type call. So I'm just multiplying the price that I pulled out times 2R S number of travelers. Why do I have to change the number of travelers to 2R? First off, what is 2R? It shouldn't be 2N for numeric. You know, it should, but our developers way back decided 2 real instead of 2 numeric. So it's a real number we're converting it to, because that's what a numeric is, kind of. Why do I have to use a real number? Why can't I convert it to an integer? Well, it's because it will not allow me to mix data types within an equation. I can't multiply a numeric by an integer and have it be a valid expression. A little quirk of the system. So, change it to a real number or a numeric, multiplying it by the price to get the total price or total amount due that's going to be put into the database in one of the fields, one of the columns. And then I have an insert statement here. This is the actual statement I'm going to be sending to the database. Insert into orders, and then I've got my customer ID, agent ID, product ID, extended price, amount due, and then the values. I've got a null and customer ID and comma 1000 for the agent ID and the product ID and the price and the amount due. Okay? So I'm creating an order entry. You'll notice I don't have an order ID in that list of values that I'm putting into the database. That's because the database is set up with a seeded value and it automatically generates the order ID. I don't know what that order ID is going to be. I really don't have any way of knowing what the next order ID is. So I let the database generate that order ID. And the insert statement here, you'll notice that I don't have that unique ID column in there. I didn't put it in this example. Should have, just make sure it was consistent end to end. Because this would actually fail because I didn't tell it what to put in that order, that final column. I would need to generate a unique ID, put it in here as the last value into the final column, and then I can query back. So I use my DB-SQL exec, run that SQL statement, send it off to the database. Then I'm going to create a where clause, and I want to pull everything back, and this is basically just like we did in the other handler. I want to pull back, in this case I'm pulling back order by order ID ascending, DB query, DB fetch. I'm only doing one query because I'm only pulling back one order. Actually, I should be descending. I think, yeah, it should be order by order ID descending, so I want to pull back the top order and play back that order with the order amount and so on. So really, I should have changed that. So the latest one's at the top. Actually, I did that over here. I just didn't do it in the description. So I did it right in the value field, but I did not do it right in my general notes here. Usually, another little key to life, use the notes section under the general tab when you want to write your queries or write whatever, because you can type it all out in there, get it all formatted just right, and then copy and paste it over into the statement. It's a lot easier than trying to actually type it directly into the statement field, as opposed to have dealt with expression editor assistant and such. And you're like, I'm going to kill myself over this expression editor assistant. Nah, use the notes page. That's a lot easier. So there's my statement. It runs, it creates the order, and then I just query and pull back the top one in the list. I was being lazy this one. I didn't use the unique ID and query based upon that to get the exact order. This is gambling that nobody's going to create another order while this handler is running by dialing in as the same customer ID on a different phone on the exact same day at the same time, generating a second order. That could mess things up. Probably not going to happen, but could. All right. So that's a couple of examples. I don't think there are any other things I was going to cover in here. Let me check real quick. Yeah. There are a couple of other ones that are more tied directly to dialer. I'm not going to be looking at those. That's pretty much it. All right. So we got a few minutes left. Any questions? Anything anybody want to explore? Any ideas you want to bounce off? I did leave room for questions at the end here. Oh, before I get too far, I should actually do the last couple slides. Training, if you want to get some training on how to do handlers, go to training.genesis.com. There are tracks on there for developers and for Interaction Center specifically, PureConnect. It's got the administering CIC system recommended for somebody who's going to do handler development, just so you understand how things look in the background. And then the Interaction Center Handler Developer course, and then of course the certification that goes with it. For those who remember back in the day, we used to have an advanced handlers course, but not enough people actually came to take it. So finally gave up. Now are the questions. Sir?
Depending on what the handler is doing, you have to give the database user that the handler is utilizing special grants to be able to read certain tables, depending on the operation that the handler is doing?
Yeah, you have to make sure that that user is set up with all the appropriate permissions on the database to do what you want to do. Yeah, it doesn't do very well to try and send an insert statement over using a user that only has read rights to the database. But we don't know what rights they have. All we know is we send it over, and if it fails, and we just report failure.
Is there a clarification in the handler whether or not you're getting the right permission?
No, there's nothing in the handler that checks to see what rights you have. Now, what you would see, there is the, let me go back over here. When you're troubleshooting, there's the Eyepiece trace logs, and that's just for handlers in general. But then there are also the IPDB server log. So if you go in through logs, there's this IPDB server, IP database server log. And that's the one you're going to look in to see more details on any errors that occurred, try to figure out what happened. It should tell you in there, oh, you didn't have rights to do that on the database. You'll probably see something like that in there. So if you need to, turn up the logging a little bit, but it should show errors in there at the standard logging levels. So that's an important one. This is only for ODBC connections when we're doing stuff to your handlers, basically. It's not going to be for writing to the call details database, that kind of thing. It's only for the handler-based database connections. Any other questions?
We've got PureConnect Cloud, and we've got a bunch of people in the company who've used CIC back in the day.
Yes.
So the whole cloud thing is kind of new to us. If we have people that have not done the certification course, but kind of know their way around, my understanding is like we can upload handlers and then somehow it goes through a review process and then gets pushed to production. Is being certified a prerequisite of that? Or if the guy knows what he's doing, can he just go and submit it for a review without that formal step being there?
That's a sticky one with the PureConnect Cloud folks. I don't remember that they required that people had to be certified for certain, but they usually want that.
I know we put it in the budget, so we're probably all good, we just haven't got there yet.
Well, and also those folks could just take the exam and pass it without having to take the course. It's not a hard exam.
Okay.
Yeah, I just pay my $200, whatever it is, take the exam and be done. Just to have that. If they start making a fuss about it. Otherwise, you have to write some handlers and show them that you know what they're doing and go through that whole thing, and it's probably faster and cheaper to get the certification. But then they might make you prove it anyway. So,
cool, thanks.
Anything else? Nope. Okie dokie. Time to end. 1 minute left, maybe. Thank you all.